The grand ballroom shimmered under the light of 1,000 chandeliers as laughter echoed off its golden walls and the scent of fresh roses, blended with the notes of a live string quartet playing in the corner, but none of that compared to the radiant smile plastered across Clara's face, the soon-to-be bride whose diamond necklace sparkled as much as her pride. Her engagement party was everything she had dreamed of, full of elite guest champagne towers and gowns that cost more than what most earned in a year, and as she twirled among well-wishers, her perfectly manicured fingers curled around her champagne glass, and her laughter rang louder than any music until her eyes locked onto a figure standing uncertainly by the entrance. It was a girl heavily pregnant, her clothes worn and loose, her hair tied in a simple ponytail, her shoes dusty and old, and her arms gently wrapped around her swollen belly as if shielding something precious from the harsh eyes around her. For a moment Clara paused, her eyebrows raised, then twisted into a smirk as whispers began floating through the crowd. Who invited her? Is she lost? Maybe she's from the staff. People murmured, trying to maintain their grace, but Clara relished the moment. Strolling gracefully toward the girl, heels clacking on the marble floor. Like a queen inspecting a trespasser, and with a sugary venom lacing her voice, Clara said, "Excuse me, this is a private event, perhaps." "The food bank is down the road," her friends giggled behind her, hiding laughter behind glittering hands. But the pregnant girl didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just looked at Clara with calm eyes that held something unnerving, something deep, as though she'd seen people like Clara before, and didn't think much of them. "I'm here for someone," she said softly, but clearly, her voice holding no shame. Clara's eyes narrowed. "Oh, really? And who might that be?" The pregnant girl looked around and then whispered, "I'll wait till he comes." Clara scoffed. "You mean the waiter? Fine, wait all night if you want. Just try not to ruin the aesthetic." She snapped her fingers, signaling the event manager, and whispered loudly to security, "Keep an eye on her. I don't want any drama near my cake." The guests nodded approvingly, their diamond smiles masking their judgmental eyes, while the girl found a quiet corner near the far pillar, away from the golden buffet tables and the clinking glasses and all the shining jewelry. She sat down slowly, resting her tired body on a small velvet bench, and placed both hands gently on her stomach, her gaze occasionally flicking toward the crowd, not with envy, not with resentment, but with a strange patience, as if she knew her time would come. The hours passed and the ballroom grew louder. The groom, Adrian, finally arrived, tall, handsome, the heir to a corporate empire, walking with charm and a sense of quiet confidence. His mother, the CEO, Margaret Winters, wasn't far behind, elegant yet formidable, a woman known across industries for building an empire from scratch, and now watching her son take the next step into society. Her approval meant everything, but Margaret had not smiled once during the celebration. She stood like a monarch, observing people, not just welcoming them. Clara fluttered toward Adrian like a butterfly in a storm, her arms wrapping around him and her voice shrill with excitement. "Darling, you're late. Everyone's been waiting for the king of the evening." Adrian smiled politely, but his eyes kept scanning the room. His smile faded slightly, as if something was missing. Then his gaze landed on the quiet corner, the pregnant girl sitting still, unnoticed by most, but not by him, and a flicker of emotion passed through his eyes before he turned back to Clara and nodded. "You look great," Clara laughed and pulled him toward the cake for photos, but Margaret didn't move. She was watching, to her gaze shifting from Adrian to the girl and back again, her mind worry silently, as though she were connecting invisible threads. Meanwhile, Clara continued basking in attention, posing with her designer gown, holding Adrian's hand like a trophy and receiving congratulations like a queen. But the energy shifted when the pregnant girl stood up and began walking slowly toward the center, her steps steady despite the weight she carried. Every eye turned to her again, this time with more interest. Whispers restarted. Adrian froze mid-photo. Clara turned, annoyed. "Is she still here?" she muttered loudly. "She's ruining every picture. Get her out." She snapped again at security, but before they could move, the girl raised her hand. "Just slightly. I need to speak with the groom." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the music, cutting through the air like a blade. The room quieted. Clara's face turned red with fury. "What is wrong with you?" she shouted. "Do you even know who this is? This is my party, my moment. How dare you speak to my fiancée, the pregnant? Girl didn't flinch again. Her calm eyes rested on Adrian, who hadn't said a word yet, and that silence was louder than anything. Margaret stepped forward suddenly, her heels echoing across the floor. The air turned sharp as she approached the girl. Slowly and looked her up and down with an unreadable expression, then softly she said, "You're late?" The room gasped. Clara's mouth dropped open. "Excuse me, Margaret," turned toward. Clara, her expression frosty, allowed me to introduce someone very important. "This is Ella, my daughter," the CEO's daughter. Clara laughed as if it were a joke, but when no one joined her, the laughter died slowly in her throat. The silence was suffocating as everyone's mind caught up with what they just heard. Margaret Winters had a daughter, the heir of the company, standing here in rags and pregnant, while Clara had just mocked her in front of the entire elite community. Adrian finally stepped forward, wrapping an arm around Ella and saying softly, "I told you to wait for the right moment." Margaret looked at him with approval. Clara stumbled back, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This is some act. Why would she look like that if she's your sister?" Margaret turned her gaze onto Clara with a look that could freeze oceans, because unlike you, she doesn't need diamonds or pearls to have worth, because she doesn't treat people like dirt, and because today she came here to see how genuine your heart really is, and you, Clara, have failed miserably. Clara tried to speak, but no words came out, her face pale, the guests all now shifting awkwardly, some pretending not to have laughed earlier, some trying to disappear into the background, while others just stared, waiting for what would happen next. Ella stood quietly, her hands on her belly, her eyes not gloating or angry, just tired, as though the weight of being tested had finally settled. Adrian looked at Clara, then at his mother, and finally at Ella, before turning back to Clara and saying, "If you can't see what's wrong with how you treated her, I don't know what kind of future we could possibly have." Clara looked into his eyes, saw the coldness growing there, the admiration gone, and felt something inside her crumble. She reached for him. "Adrian, please, I didn't know. I thought she was." He cut her off. "That's the point. You didn't care to know. You saw someone who looked beneath you and decided she didn't deserve respect." Ella tried to intervene. "Adrian, it's fine," but he shook his head. "No, it's not fine. It's never fine. And today?" Everyone saw it, including me. The guests watched in silence. The party now a battlefield of judgment and realization. Clara stood, trembling, the weight of her choices crushing the glitter she had tried to hide behind, and as Adrian walked Ella to the side, gently helping her sit and offering her water, Ella remained alone in the center of the room, surrounded by beauty, yet stripped of dignity. Margaret looked at her one last time and said, "We were never looking for a bride who sparkled. We were looking for one with a soul," and walked away. The music stopped, the laughter faded, and all that remained in that golden room was the heavy silence of a lesson delivered, and a heartbroken woman finally understanding that the shine she wore on the outside meant nothing when her heart remained cold. The night dragged on in haunting silence after Margaret's words fell like judgment upon the party's dazzling walls, and while the chandeliers still flickered and the violinists continued to play out of obligation, no one truly heard the music anymore, not even Clara, whose legs threatened to buckle beneath her as she stood motionless in her designer heels, surrounded by guests who now looked at her not with admiration but with unease, as if they feared her fall from grace was contagious, and none wanted to be caught in its collapse. Adrian led Ella gently to a more comfortable chair, his hand hovering protectively near her back, while Margaret summoned one of the senior staff members to bring warm water and a cushion, and still Clara did not move, her mind spinning wildly, trying to piece together how everything had crumbled in mere minutes, and how the girl she mocked had turned out to be the most powerful person in the room, second only to the woman she had desperately hoped to impress. For months, Clara had built her image around perfection, around being worthy of a man like Adrian, but she never imagined she would be tested not like this, and certainly not by someone who didn't look the part, not someone whose shoes were scuffed and whose dress had no label and whose belly suggested vulnerability, not power, and yet the truth had ripped through her illusions like fire through silk. While people began murmuring around her, Clara slowly backed toward the edge of the hall, hoping to escape the spotlight, but Margaret's sharp voice called her back. "Don't hide now, we haven't finished speaking." Clara froze and turned slowly, her face pale, lips trembling and heart pounding so loud she could hardly hear. Her self-breathed Margaret didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke pierced like ice. "I don't care for appearances, Clara. I never have, and neither does my company. What we value is character, and you failed the moment you saw someone you was. Thought beneath you and chose cruelty over kindness. The world already has too. Many people who decorate themselves with gold but carry dust inside their souls." Adrian had never taken his eyes off Clara, and now he turned to Clara as well, his jaw set with the kind of finality that made Clara's chest tighten with dread. "I wanted to believe you were better than the parties, better than the gossip, better than the elitism, but today, when it mattered most, you chose to protect. It's your image, not another human being, even if you didn't know who she was." Ella tried once again to interrupt. "Please stop. This is not what I came for." But Margaret held up a hand, not to silence her daughter, but to continue with measured grace. "You did come here for something, Ella, and you got your answer, and now, Clara, you have yours." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She had rehearsed apologies in front of mirrors for smaller things, but this was too real, too raw, and too exposed. And now, even her breath felt like it burned in her throat. The crowd began to disperse, unsure whether they were allowed to stay or should quietly disappear, some offered awkward nods to Margaret. Others mumbled congratulations to Adrian, while very few dared even glance at Clara again, as if her disgrace would reflect on them if they stared too long. And still she stood frozen, until finally she turned and walked out of the ballroom, shoes clicking slowly like a fallen queen leaving a throne made of glass and shame. Meanwhile, Ella leaned into the chair, closing her eyes as a wave of fatigue hit her, the baby inside kicking gently as if responding to the chaos outside. Her womb, Adrian crouched beside her, his voice soft. "I didn't know she'd go that far. Are you all right, Ella?" Opened her eyes slowly and nodded. "I wasn't here for revenge. I just wanted to know who she was. If you were safe with her, I had to be sure." Adrian smiled faintly. "You've always looked out for me, even when we were kids," Ella laughed gently. "Not much has changed, has it?" Adrian shook his head, "Except now you carry more than my secrets." He touched her belly gently, his eyes softening with a tenderness that melted the stiffness from his face. Margaret sat beside them now for the first time, showing something other than her icy business persona. She reached for Ella's hand and held it. "Your father would have been proud of you today. You stood with grace, even under fire." Ella looked at her mother with tired affection. "I'm not sure what to feel right now. All I know is I'm glad. I saw the truth before it was too late, and I'm glad. Adrian knows it too." The rest of the evening was quiet, with only a few guests remaining. The staff began clearing away half-eaten desserts and untouched champagne glasses, while the musicians packed their instruments in the corner. Everyone had come for a celebration, but left with a lesson. Clara walked alone through the cold driveway of the estate, her thoughts spiraling and crashing like waves inside her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last, until she reached her car and sat behind the wheel, staring at her reflection in the mirror, her mascara smudged, her lips dry, her diamond earrings mocking her from her own ears. She had always believed she could handle anything, that beauty and charm could open every door and seal every wound. But tonight those things had betrayed her. Or perhaps they had blinded her long before she entered that ballroom. She placed her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming, tears pouring silently down her cheeks, not because she had lost Adrian, not yet, but because deep inside she feared she had never deserved him, and now she might never get the chance to prove otherwise. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel envied or adored. She felt exposed. She felt weak. She felt like the very thing she had spent her life mocking, broken, lost, uncertain. And it wasn't the judgment of others that burned her, it was the echo of her own voice when she'd called Ella a beggar, as if she had been spitting on herself all along back in the mansion. Margaret stood by the large window, watching the shadows move outside, her expression unreadable. But her eyes softer than usual beside her, Adrian brought Ella a warm blanket and a bowl of fruit, silently encouraging her to eat. And as she peeled a slice of apple, Ella whispered, "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just couldn't sit back and watch." "You marry someone who would damage you." Adrian looked down, his voice low. "I know, and part of me knew too, but I ignored it because I didn't want to lose the picture. I had painted of our future together." Ella tilted her head. "Then maybe that's why it had to break now, so you could draw a real one, and not one made of illusions and expectations and masks." Adrian sighed. "She made me feel like, gosh, I was enough. But I think it was because she needed me to believe that so I wouldn't see how empty." She felt inside. Margaret joined them quietly. There is a kind of loneliness that dresses itself in pride, a kind that feeds on admiration but dies when love asks for honesty. "I saw it in Clara long ago, but I knew you had to see it for yourself only." Then, does the heart truly decide? Adrian placed his arm around Ella, who rested her head on his shoulder, and the room filled with a quiet that was no longer heavy, but healing. Outside, Clara had not driven home. Quiet hilltop overlooking the city where lights blinked and sparkled. Like stars laughing at her loneliness, she sat there thinking of the little girl she used to be, the one who had been told she was never good enough unless she looked perfect, behaved perfectly, made others envy her, and she had spent years turning herself into that girl, sculpting her body, her face, her voice, even her thoughts into something socially accepted, something admired, but in doing so, she had starved the part of her that mattered most. And now, when tested not by society, but by simple human decency, she had failed, and it hurt, because she saw now that her fall was not sudden. It had been slow and silent, like water leaking from a crack she had ignored back. At the mansion, Adrian sat beside Ella, who had fallen asleep, her breathing steady, her hands resting on her stomach, and Margaret smiled for the first time that evening, not because everything had gone well, but because truth had finally triumphed over appearances, and that was all she had ever hoped for. Margaret thought back to the moment she had sent Ella away 5 years ago, when news of her unexpected pregnancy had threatened to spark rumors across boardrooms and tabloids, and how at the time protecting the company felt more urgent than protecting her daughter. And even though Ella had agreed with tears in her eyes to leave quietly, Margaret never forgave herself for choosing image over intimacy tonight. However, Ella had returned, not to punish but to protect, not to tear down but to rebuild, and that meant more than any legacy, more than any billion-dollar empire. It meant family, it meant redemption, and as she looked at her children, one asleep, one awake, she realized that tonight they had all learned something about each other that went beyond wealth or status. It was a night of revelations, painful but pure, and perhaps that was what love truly looked like, stripped of perfection, raw and willing to grow. Morning light filtered through the mansion's grand windows, casting golden streaks across polished floors and velvet drapes. As a new day began, not just for the world outside, but for every soul that had been changed within these walls overnight. Ella awoke to the scent of freshly brewed tea and soft birdsong outside her window, her body aching slightly, but her heart lighter than it had been in months. The baby stirred inside her as if sensing peace, and her hand instinctively found her belly as she smiled faintly beside her. Margaret sat reading a file, though her eyes occasionally wandered toward her daughter with a softness few had ever seen in the legendary CEO. Once feared and revered across industries, the transformation that had begun the night before still clung to the air like dew, as if the entire household had exhaled some long-held tension and was finally breathing freely again. Adrian entered moments later, shirt untucked hair, a little messy eyes, tired, but warm as he smiled at his sister and said good morning like it was the most important greeting he'd ever spoken. And Ella responded, not with sarcasm or formality, but with warmth of her own, a smile that said, I see you and thank you, and I forgive you, because that was what forgiveness looked like, not some grand speech, but a quiet continuation of love despite everything. Adrian sat beside her, handing her a slice of buttered toast, and resting his hand briefly on her shoulder. Last night was heavy, but I think it was necessary, he said. And Margaret nodded silently before adding, the weight of truth always feels unbearable until it frees you. Ella leaned back, sipping her tea, and glanced toward the door where a soft knock interrupted the stillness. A maid entered hesitantly, holding an envelope, her eyes nervous as she handed it to Adrian before leaving the room, and when he opened it, he found a single letter. Inside, the handwriting shaky yet familiar, it was from Clara, and it read, simply, "I know I do not deserve to be heard, but I need you to read this. I need to tell you everything, not to win you back, not to excuse myself, but because you deserve to understand who I was and who I became and why I broke, and maybe in doing so I can start to fix myself." Adrian read the words quietly, then looked up at Ella and Margaret, who had both stopped to watch him. He stood and said, "I need to see her," and they didn't stop him because they knew this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about closure, about clarity, and perhaps about compassion. So, Adrian left the estate, driving toward a modest apartment complex on the edge of the city. A place Clara had retreated too far from the marble floors and designer perfumes she had once bathed in, now replaced with silence, reflection, and a mirror that showed her more than makeup ever had. Clara opened the door slowly, her eyes red from nights of crying, but her posture straight, as if she had finally found something real too. "Stand on, thank you for coming," she said, and Adrian nodded, not because he forgave her yet, but because he was willing to listen, and they sat in silence for a long time before Clara finally spoke. "I didn't grow up with wealth, Adrian, not even close. I grew up with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who drank away her salary, and my childhood was spent watching my mother hide bruises behind lipstick and pride. I told myself I would never be powerless like her. I would never be humiliated. I would be someone who was worshipped, not wounded, and when I met you, you were everything I thought would keep me safe. Powerful, respected, untouchable, and I tried so hard to be perfect for you, not because I loved you at first, but because I loved what you represented, and then slowly I began to love you too, but by then, I had already built a castle of lies around me, and every time I acted superior, it wasn't because I felt I was better, it was because I was terrified you'd see I wasn't. Enough inside, I was still the scared little girl watching her mother cry over burnt dinner and shattered glass, and I know now that doesn't excuse what I did to your sister. I saw her, and I saw everything I had run away from. I saw my mother. I saw myself, and I couldn't handle it, so I lashed out. I tore her down so I could stand taller, and it broke me to know I had become the very person I promised myself I'd never be. I am sorry, Adrian, not because I lost you, but because I lost myself. And I finally see it now." Adrian listened in silence, his face unreadable, his fingers loosely curled as he stared at the woman he once imagined growing old with, and now saw with new eyes, not full of contempt but full of cautious understanding. He said softly, "It would have taken more strength to show that broken part of you than to hide it behind glitter and cruelty." Clara nodded. "I know, and I didn't have that strength then, but I want to find it now. I want to become someone I can respect again, and I know I can't ask for another chance, but I can ask you to believe I'll try to be better, not for you, for me, and maybe someday I'll meet someone who loves me, not for what I wear, but for what I've learned." Adrian stood slowly, placing the letter on the table, and said, "I hope you do, because we all deserve a chance to heal." He left without saying goodbye. Because some goodbyes don't need to be spoken, only felt, and Clara closed the door behind him, standing quietly in her apartment, letting the silence embrace her like a second skin, knowing that her path now would be longer, harder, lonelier, but also more honest back at the mansion. Ella was preparing to leave for her final checkup before the baby's arrival. Margaret insisted on coming along, and so did Adrian, the 3 of them riding together like a fragile but mending trio. The clinic welcomed them with familiarity and warmth, the doctor smiling kindly as she examined Ella and confirmed everything looked healthy. The baby was strong, the mother glowing, and soon the room was filled with laughter and relief, and for the first time in months, Ella allowed herself to dream about the future, not one filled with fear or shame, but one where her child would grow up surrounded by truth and love, and a family that had been tested and still stood. Margaret held Ella's hand during the ultrasound, her eyes misting over as she saw the tiny, fluttering heartbeat on the screen, and whispered, "You were brave when I wasn't, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." After the appointment, they drove to a quiet garden where Adrian had planned a surprise. A small stone bench with Ella's name carved into it beneath a blossoming tree, and beneath that, a simple line that read, "Strength blooms in silence." Ella's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry, not out of pain, but from the overwhelming feeling of being seen, of being valued, not for her title or her lineage, but for her journey, for her heart, for the simple fact that she chose to return. When she could have stayed away that evening back at the mansion, a small dinner was held, nothing grand, nothing polished, just home-cooked food and warm conversations, and laughter that came not from politeness, but from shared memory and repaired bonds. And as they sat around the table, Adrian asked softly, "What should we name the baby?" And Ella paused, then looked at her mother and said quietly, "I was thinking Grace. Because that's what carried me through." Margaret nodded and smiled, and Adrian placed his hand over Ella's with a warmth that melted the last remnants of winter between them. Meanwhile, far across the city, Clara sat at her small desk writing in a notebook, journaling her thoughts, mapping out her plans, volunteering at a shelter, applying for counseling, sending an anonymous donation to the maternity ward where Ella had been treated, and beginning to plant seeds of redemption, not in the world but inside herself. And as she turned off the lights and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she whispered to the universe, "Thank you for the lesson." And somewhere, deep inside, a small peace began to grow in the months that followed. Ella gave birth to a beautiful baby girl with bright eyes and a calming presence, and as she held her for the first time in her arms, she whispered, "Welcome to a world where your story begins, not in shame but in strength and love." And the room was filled with joy as Adrian and Margaret stood nearby, both wiping tears and exchanging a glance that said, "This is our new beginning." Over time, the mansion became less of a symbol of power and more of a home, with laughter echoing through its halls and a nursery filled with lullabies and gentle warmth, and photos on the wall that captured not perfection, but progress, truth, forgiveness, and all the beautiful chaos that comes with healing. And while the world outside continued its noise and rush inside this family, a quiet miracle had unfolded, not the kind that headlines capture, but the kind that lives in every look of understanding, in every choice to show up even when it hurts, in every apology spoken and accepted, and every child born into a love that has already conquered its own darkness. And so the girl once mistaken for a beggar now rocked her daughter to sleep in a room filled with stories of courage, and the woman who once wore diamonds now walked city streets with nothing but her name, her purpose, and the resolve to become a better version of herself. And though their paths had diverged, their souls were both marked by the same fire, a moment that burned away illusion and left behind only truth. And in that truth they had all found their light. Asterisk.